And welcome to our class today. I'm Dr. Ulrich. We met very briefly before, and I will be rounding out this course as Dr. Moody is unavailable. I will, of course, be in contact with her throughout this because I want to make this as streamlined as possible, and I want the expectations you started with to be the expectations that we ended with. Now, I know we've had terrible weather. Now, here in Denver, we got some snow. It's about 4 inches of snow, and we actually set a record for cold, but y'all got some ice. I'm from Michigan originally, and I'll drive in snow, but I'm very careful about ice. So with this video, I just want you to watch it before the discussion section. We're not going to do, well, we're going to do plenty with its contents, but research shows that students do better if they have lecture and reading than just reading. So let's keep this as quick and painless as possible, because I want you to take some time since you got the day off to catch up and maybe even just relax a little bit. So I am going to share with you a PowerPoint and that Dr. Moody has prepared, and I don't have the reading. I was actually, when I was going to do this discussion, there's points where it's, there's supposed to be a quote or something from the reading, but I don't have the text with me. So I was going to say, well, yeah, I'll select a quote and we'll look at it together and do a little discussion. Instead, you're just going to have me and a can talking, and if we're referring to a specific passage that I don't have access to, we're just going to kind of go and kind of go with that. All right, so let's get started. Let me get the share screen going, and we'll be ready to rock. La la la. I know it's very exciting here watching me figure out how to use a computer. I have a bit of a troublesome laptop these days. It likes to fight with me a bit. All right. We are almost there. You're almost there. Just 1 second here. Yes, yes, come on. Do my thing. Do the thing I want you to. Okay. All right, so here we are. The first thing we're going to talk about, well, the main thing we're going to talk about today is Hindu reform under colonial rule. Now, we'll remember that the British East India Company started like in 1600, and they first went to the east side of India. They got set up in Bengal, and they were really the first sort of global transnational corporation. Some people would say that the British East India Company was the first sort of neoliberal neoliberal sort of corporation, being that no trade on regulation, or no regulation on trade, not really having a country behind this organization. So the British East India Company was started as a private organization that later, after the Indian Mutiny in 1857, was actually nationalized, and then the British government then controlled India. But up until that time, up until the British and up until this mutiny in 1857, it was really that a corporation sort of controlled India. They didn't completely control it. There was lots of revolt, and they didn't have absolute domination. But they darn got close. I mean, imagine, if you will, if like GE or whatever your cable company is sort of came in and started controlling everything. It'd be kind of wild. All right, so we're going to look at British colonial rule in context and the history of India, and how Hindus and Christians both engaged in colonial rule. Some thrived, some did not. We shall see. Okay, so let's put this into context. What do we mean by British rule in India? So at the earliest age of India, we have this idea that the Aryan invasion came in and intermingled with sort of the Dravidian people, mostly in the Northwest. And you have this time period where you have the sort of the Vedic time, and then you have a level of urbanization. And then after that, you have the Mauryans, who were Jains and Buddhists, but plenty of them were Hindus. And from there, you have the Buddhist king Ashoka, then who was known for being sort of nonviolent and this great sort of imperial ruler. After the Mauryans, you have the Guptas. They call this the golden age of the Guptas, from roughly from 200 BCE through 400 to 600 CE. And this was a time when all of India was ruled by this ostensibly Hindu kingdom, though Hinduism really didn't exist as we know it now back then. So these were sort of considered to be this time of great Indian independence. When I say it's a golden age, it's like every golden age. people refer to it in order to make themselves feel good about their sort of own age, because the Hindu nationalists will say, oh, we got to get back to the golden age of Hinduism. But that golden age wasn't really all that Hindu when you get right down to it. During the Guptas, you had quite a bit of flourishing of Jains and quite a big flourishing of of Jains and Buddhists and bunches of different types of Hinduism. Then you get into the era of the independent kingdoms. After the Guptas, you have sort of like all sorts of these like little kingdoms all over the place, and this is described as an era of military belligerence. There's lots of competition between all of these sort of kingdom groups, and it led to sort of a fragmenting of any sort of larger overall identity in the geographic regions. After that, you have the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal rule. This starts in like the Mughals, who are Muslims. Mughal comes from Mongol. In fact, they were the Central Asian Muslim people that came down and sort of took over in sort of like the 1300s, 1400s, really get well established there, and they ruled India until the British got there. So you really only have like, including the Delhi Sultanate, you have about 500, 600, 700 years where there was Muslim rule, though the way folks talk about it, you'd think it was a lot longer. And even during that era, there were only a few hundred years where there was really a solidly Muslim group that was really ruling India. Then the 1600s, the British East India Company comes and displaces the Muslim Mughals and sort of steadily tries to fragment the country as much as possible, often along religious lines, in order to rule. So what I want you to do is I want you to have some context that there was a lot of flux before the British that the British got there. Now the British are going to say that they brought civilization to India, but you have, you know, ostensibly these three eras that are quite civilized before the British got there. So as I had said before, you have the Aryans in that first area, who were not rulers per se, but they were a large cultural group. Then from in the south, you have the Cholas. That's a dynasty that ruled from 300 BCE to 1300. So they actually had a long-standing sort of Hindu, sort of ostensibly Hindu rulership for a long period in the south. Also in the south, you have the Pandyas, who ruled from 600 BCE into roughly the 600 CE. We have the Mauryas that I described. This was a Buddhist group from 322 BCE to 185 BCE. So they were Buddhist and very Jain. Ostensibly, they were actually much more Jain than they were Buddhist, we're starting to find out. Then we have the Guptas, who rule from roughly 320 BCE up to 500 CE. And then you have smaller groups, such as the Senas in Bengal from the 11th to the 12th century, who were also Hindus. And then after that, you get mostly large ruling dynasties that were Hindu. I know that's a lot of information, but we're just getting the context. The idea is there were plenty of ostensibly Hindu kingdoms before the British were there, that there were lots of, there were various imperial groups and sort of empires that were found in India. There was a lot of structure there before the British came in, despite them always saying that there was no structure before them. Okay, so political history, what I want you to understand is it's not just about politics, but it's about the exchange of cultures and values. So when the Mauryas had this control of India, they spread quite a bit of Jainism and Buddhism throughout India, especially toward the south. Then when the Guptas were around, they're ostensibly the first Hindu type temple type group. They sponsored a lot of Brahmin encampments. But what they also did, and when we look through inscriptions, is find that they also sponsored quite a diverse group of Hindus. So they sponsored people who worship Shiva, people that worship Vishnu, quite a few temples and monuments in the Gupta era to the sun god, Surya. You also saw that the Guptas, when they saw it convenient, would sponsor Jains and Buddhists. So some of those values are expressed through religious ideas and practices. Now we saw with Kabir that Hindus and Muslims would mingle and they would pick up and reject other people's ideas. As these dynasties rose, there was shifting ideas. So, like I said, with the Guptas and the Mauryas, they spread a lot of Jainism and Buddhism. This changed the culture in general. When the British come, these Western ideas get sort of interjected and intermingled with Indian ideas. Now, the British ruled from the 18th century to the 20th century. Now, not a lot of people converted to Christianity. There's still not a lot of Christianity to this day. Now, you do have people especially in Bengal in the east, that refer themselves as Anglo-Indians. So these are Christians who are often half Indian and half Western, but these days you can they look like everyone else, but they have common names, such as my buddy Sam Moreland, who's very Indian, but he is what they call an Anglo-Indian. So we have various ruling sites still at this time, such as Rajputana, which was Hindu, that's in the west. Then you have Kashmir in the north, Hindu. Mysore in the south, large kingdom of Mysore, and that's actually the area where contemporary yoga comes from, which is also Hindu. Then you have Cochin in the west, which in Kerala, that had a kind of a very dominant Hindu sort of vibe to it. Then furthermore, if you want to look at sort of a Muslim area, you have Hyderabad in sort of the southeast. Hyderabad was ostensibly Muslim. None of these groups were Christian. So Christianity might not have taken hold, though the British would have liked it to. But many of these Western ideas did intermingle with the sort of indigenous religions of India. So, as I'd said, not many converts to Christianity, but Hindus and Christians would encounter and engage with one another's religious ideas and practices. Ostensibly, Christianity had been there since the Apostle Thomas in the 2nd century, or not. But we have Christian communities in the west, south of India as well. So, Hindus knew about Christianity. Then when the British came, they might not have converted to Christianity, but they would have conversations, and Christian ideas would work their way into their Hinduism. And it can be argued through certain academic prisms that Indian ideas did influence the Western Academy from the British colonists being there and encountering Hinduism. So one of the reformers we're going to talk about today is Ram Mohan Roy, who founded the Brahmo Samaj in Bengal. What did he have to say? Well, he had a number of arguments, but here's some key arguments that do end up persisting in Hindu culture. One, he argued that Christianity is about moral precepts and monotheism. There is only one God. Idolatry in Hinduism is misguided. We're going to see this reform move commonly. There were several groups in India that became quite influential that would after their encounter with Western culture and with Christianity, they would argue that Hinduism is in fact monotheist and there is only one God. You might call him by various names, Vishnu or Shiva or whatever. Some would even just move away from any sectarianism at all and would only talk about God in general, Deva. They would reject idolatry. And they would say that Christianity, you don't have to worry about that salvation in Jesus thing, but you can see that they have specific morality that Indians liked and wanted to pick up. And they liked this notion of monotheism. To argue that there is no monotheism before Christianity and Hinduism is a little off, because a lot of the groups who were, say, devoted to Shiva or Vishnu would not necessarily deny that other gods exist, but their relationship with their God was so intense and grand that it might as well have been a monotheism. So Ram Mohan Roy creates the Brahmo Sabha, also called the Brahmo Samaj, in 1828. Now this group is monotheistic. It's all about Brahma, the one God, the God that doesn't come up all that much until this point. Brahma was the creator God in the Vedas, but he very quickly becomes an object of almost ridicule in later stories. And to this date, I mean, we don't have any temples to Brahma in India. I mean, maybe there's one or two. Intriguingly, the god Brahma is actually quite common in Thailand. So while you have a god who has been not necessarily rejected, but sort of forgotten in India, when Hinduism and eventually Buddhism travels to Thailand, the god Brahma becomes very big. So they reject Murti, or image worship. They reject the Puranas. Puranas are texts that are might as well be called antiquary texts or the old texts. Puran in Hindi just means old. and just calls them mythology. Now, when I say mythology, I mean any story that does work, any story that points to a larger truth. So I would equally say the teachings of Jesus about the metaphysics of the world, or of Moshe and the metaphysics of the world, and Hindu sort of descriptions of the way the world is formed by Shiva or Brahma, whatever, all of those are equal. Those are mythology. However, this is using the term mythology in a pejorative sense, in the sense that mythology is just a made-up tale that we don't need to worry about. Sort of like the way that we think about Greek mythology. We don't think of those as true stories, but a Greek person would have. They would meet once a week to read and discuss scripture. What does that sound like? Sounds like going to church, doesn't it? Yes. So what did Christians have to say about Ram Mohan Roy when they encountered him? They're like, well, let's see. They would say, well, you've misunderstood Christianity because you don't accept the deity of Christ, especially the Trinity, and salvation from God, so the redemption of Christ. They would also say that you reject human depravity, the fall of mankind and original sin. As this is the case, missionaries would look and say, you've picked up Christianity, but you haven't really got it. So, for instance, I was in Benares one time, and I was sitting reading a book and enjoying a cup of tea when I heard a whole bunch of people speaking with Michigan accents. And I am from Michigan, I can spot it. It could have been Ohio accent. But they were talking about their mission trip to India. And in fact, I was listening to them speaking and complaining that the guys in Hindi weren't translating them properly. I don't know how they knew, because they didn't speak Hindi. And they were saying that, you know, when they'd ask people, well, what do you think of this? They'd say like, oh, okay, yeah, Jesus Christ is your guru. Jesus is a great guru. And they're like, no, this is all wrong. Now, why am I telling you this story? The story is, you're not allowed to be a missionary in India. After the British, the Indians were like, nope, no more missionaries, you're not allowed. So people still sneak in on tourist visas to do missionizing, and they should be arrested. Okay, so you had a lot of Baptists at the time, Baptist missionaries, who were arguing at home with Unitarians who believed that kind of all of religious truth was sort of the same under a God that is essentially the same in all religions. Or the deists, who are the clockmakers. I know that's a funny thing to say, but deists believe that God created the world and then just walked away from it, like he made a big clock and walked away from it. If you were to build a clock, yeah, deists. So anyway, like Baptist missionaries were fighting this argument that everything was kind of the same and denying the Christian Trinity and whatnot. So in India, they really kind of tried to double down and said Christianity is about the deity of Christ, the sin of humankind, and the redemption of humankind through Christ. So what did the Hindus have to say to this? Well, the Hindus didn't quite like Roy either. In fact, they excommunicated him. To excommunicate someone means to throw someone out of a church and make them sort of not allowed to associate with people in the church anymore. They even took away his status as a Brahmin. Other Hindus were like, man, that makes perfect sense. There are too many gods, there's too much mythology. Let's just do our thing, believe in one God, ignore the ritual worship. We'll have this simplified, streamlined religion. It works for the Christians. Why don't we do it? So what would Ram Mohan Roy say to the Hindus? He'd say that Hinduism, he would say that normal people's notion of Hinduism was just sort of, I'm sorry, I got this wrong. So Hindus reacting to Ram Mohan Roy would also say, you know, you're missing out on kind of the glory of Hinduism, and you're being misled by Christians. We see what you're doing here. You're building sort of Christianized Hinduism or a Hinduized Christianity, and we're not into it. So here's one quote on a reply to my critics on what is Hindu religion. Hindus oftentimes commit the error in the heat of controversy, without seeing what they gain thereby, of likening their systems to other systems of the world. Some of them have also, without examining our own system or taking a lesson from existing facts, imbibed an Occidental or Western. So Orient means the direction in which the sun rises. The sun rises in the east. This is why we say orient yourself. To orient yourself is to turn to the east where the sun rises. So Orient, east, where the sun rises. Occident, to the west. So Orient, the east, Occident, to the west. Oriental, Occidental. Anyway, so some of them have also, without examining our own system or taking a lesson from existing facts, imbibed an Occidental Western mode of thought. And they cannot get over certain ideas, not very broad, regarding religion, which they have learned from the conceptions of the West. To them, religion is objective and not subjective. It is not the real living faith of an individual man, but his nominal adherence to a set of beliefs, alleged to be the common faith of a community. To some of them, perhaps, implies a book for a guide. To some of them, it perhaps implies a book for a guide, and a book which claims to reveal the words of God. And when twitted by an opponent with the question of what they have to appeal to, they say it is the Vedas. Forgetting that, and thus placing the claims of these in opposition to the Quran or the Bible, they make their own system as narrow as, if not narrower, than any of these. So he's arguing that the Veda is kind of grander than just a simple book. You got to remember that the Vedas are thought to be apurusheya. They are thought to be authorless. One of my first Hinduism teachers would say, it's like you have a radio. You got to tune it into the right station. The rishis, the seers, the ones who heard and recorded the Vedas and sang them out, were tuned into the right station. This is to say that the Vedas are ongoing everywhere. You could tune in and be a rishi, be a seer, be a hearer of the Veda if you're able to tune into it. It's happening everywhere. So that's intriguing, but it's also a problem because so much of Hinduism is not in the Vedas. In fact, all of the rituals you see in Hindu temples are actually out of the Tantras, to some degree the Puranas, but they're actually found in the Tantras. So Hinduism is way more than the Vedas, and we're going to see with various religious groups, they'll say, we're all going back to the Vedas. But the reality of it is, they didn't go back to the Vedas. They didn't go back and study the Vedas. The Vedas are a very difficult type of Sanskrit. They were only marginally translated into English. The translations of the Indian vernaculars aren't that great either. So they said they go back to the Vedas. They didn't really go back to the Vedas. I have a friend who always argues about a group called the Arya Samaj. We'll talk about them later. It's very similar to this group. He said, they're a little bit like the Baptists. There's one book. Everything's in there. Nobody reads it. So here's another reaction to Ram Mohan Roy. In fact, here we have a guy named Ramakrishna, whom I adore. Ramakrishna is great. He was sort of a mystic and a yogi and a tantrika and a temple priest. And he ended up inspiring Vivekananda, who was one of his students, who becomes arguably the greatest yogi of the 20th century. But we have Ramakrishna here, who we're going to talk about today. Now, Ramakrishna does not reject Christianity per se. In fact, there's a story about him that he decided to practice all the religions. He was a Hindu. So he says, all right, I'm going to be a Buddhist for a day. So he goes out and he's a Buddhist. He's like, that's good. Hinduism's better. Then he's a Jain. He's like, that was kind of intense, but Hinduism's better. And then he's a Christian. And he does Christianity for a day. He says, it's all right. Hinduism's better. All these are true, but Hinduism's the best. Mostly because he was an ecstatic. He was a visionary. He would have visions of the goddess. And for him, if you're not having a vision of the goddess, you're just messing around. So he doesn't reject Christianity per se, but he's definitely not rejecting the direct experiences he has of Kali and the daily worship of Kali in the temple and through murtis. He even has had visions of Christ, direct visions of Christ and Muhammad and angels and whatnot, but he's still like, Kali is the place. In fact, he says that Jesus Christ was the great yogi, if not the greatest of yogis. So this is a story about how he practiced all paths, and including many Hindu paths, but decided that Hinduism was the best place for him. So which Christians engaged Hinduism? Well, we have a picture of the German philosopher Schopenhauer and the philologist Max Muller. What's a philologist? Well, a philologist is someone who studies language and changes in language over time. They dig through handwritten manuscripts trying to get the best and most faithful versions of text. Max Muller studied quite widely, but he especially settled on Sanskrit to really engage with. Now, he didn't convert from Christianity, but he definitely said that Vedanta, a specific type of Hindu philosophy becomes sort of his most intriguing and happy sort of conversations. Schopenhauer, who was known for being a classic pessimist, he wrote a couple of books called The World as Will and Representation, was also very fond of the Upanishads and Vedanta. So Alexander Duff, in fact, was a missionary for the Church of Scotland, and he was not into Hindu temple worship. He says that temples are sites where souls are not made to contemplate, are not made to think about God, and that the murtis, the images, are senseless. So when you're dealing with Duff, he had this idea that he was going to form a Western-style education system in India, and he established quite a few schools, and he decided they should be taught in English, not in any of the indigenous languages, not in Hindi, not in Bengali, not in Gujarati, but only in English. And his idea was, if you educate the elites, they will then convert to Christianity and take that Christianity to the villages. And if you teach them in English, that Christianity will be even more apparent. It will be even more powerful. So Max Muller argues that the Upanishads, on the other hand, are respectable and may contain truth. Max Muller had a great respect and sort of love for the Upanishads and would write about them and translate them quite lovingly. So we have one British guy who wants to found the education system, or wants to alter the education system of India to convert everybody to Christianity. This guy also lived in India for like 30 years. And in many ways abolish Hindu culture. And then you have another guy, Max Muller, who never actually went to India, who was like, Hinduism's kind of amazing. These Upanishads are like the mystical truth I was always looking for. So those are two different ideas. One sort of romantic about the glorious philosophy of India, and the other based in politics and power and wanting to get everybody to be converted to Christianity. So in this sense, Hindus and Christians sometimes had quite a lot in common when you talk about the reformers. So, and one of the things they said is that early Hindu rule, the Guptas and the Mauryas, they thought was great. That was the golden age. That was wonderful. But then when you had sort of the Hindu rule that was the different kingdoms that were warring, that's down because everything was chaotic. This was also the time when we saw a lot of really exciting writing starts. This time of the fragmented kingdoms was the time when the tantras really get going. And you have very exciting ideas amongst the Buddhists, the Hindus, and to some degree the Jain tantras. So Jains had tantras in which they actually have quite a bit of black magic, which is something that I find always very exciting. Anyway, so this is a time that I think is actually one of the richest time in the history of India because there's just so much exciting writing happens. This is the time of the Puranas, so those old texts that you can think of them as long sort of extensive soap operas of the gods. A lot of our stories we hear about, you know, Shiva and Krishna and whatnot come out of the Puranas. You also have the Tantras at that time, but boo! You'll also see that a lot of the scholars writing about this time up until recent times have said that the Tantras and the Puranas were the worst of the texts, but the texts before them were the glorious stuff, were the gloryful texts, or the really great texts. So this shows that even in the academy, us scholars of Hinduism reproduce these ideas of these reformers and of these Christian mystics and of these Christian missionaries. So we ourselves as academics and scholars ought to shine a light on ourselves and wonder, well, why haven't we studied this period that we have more writing than ever and considered it degenerate? Well, we're picking up this idea that comes out of these Christian missionaries and reformers. Muslim rule, bad, because all things Muslim are bad, according to the Hindus and the Christians. However, one of the things you do see that the Hindu reformers were like, nope, this Christian rule stinks. We don't like your religion. We don't like the fact that you've taken over our country. We don't like the fact that you've taken us from a wealthy civilization to be a broke civilization. We don't like the fact that you've plundered everything. So over time, we get this idea of this glorious golden age of Hinduism. Like I was saying before, you have the Upanishads that, and also Ram Mohan Roy would say, go back to the Upanishads and the Vedas. Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who formed the Arya Samaj, said the same thing. So did Max Muller. All of them were like, oh, yeah, this is the good time, the Vedic times and the philosophy times, the Buddhism and Jainism times. But when you get into that fragmented kingdoms era, right around 600, which is right also the time that temples start, oh, by the way, no temples in India until 600. I mean, there were a few kind of, but not really. Temple Hinduism doesn't even really get going until around then. Anyway, So that era through the Muslim era and into the contemporary time of British rule, these are considered to be sort of degenerate times of Christianity, or times of Hinduism, whereas the glorious times were the times of the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata. Okay, so now we have this other character. We have Swami Vivekananda. Now, Swami Vivekananda is remembered to be like one of the great Indian statesmen and philosophers. His books are great, orators. However, he was also had this foot in this mystic world because he was Ramakrishna's student. So Ramakrishna, who didn't speak English, didn't give a lot of lectures, was known for mystic visions of God. Well, Vivekananda took everything in a different direction and talked about the philosophy of the Upanishads once again. Interestingly, with Vivekananda, he wanted independence from the British. However, he would also argue that he wanted India to be thoroughly enriched. He was an Indian nationalist, not a Hindu nationalist. He was a Hindu and he was a nationalist, but he was an Indian nationalist. So when he would tour the world giving lecture talks and raising money, it wasn't to propound Hinduism, but to make India a better place. We'll come back on that. I want you to read his writings or his speech from the World Politics of Religion. We're going to discuss it on Thursday. Okay, so I just want to say that Vivekananda is somewhere in between Ram Mohan Roy and this ecstatic guru of his who was a temple priest. So when you're reading on Thursday, I want you to think about a couple of things. How is Vivekananda presenting Hinduism to his largely Christian audience? Now, he's giving a lecture in 1883 in Chicago, or 1893 in Chicago, to a mostly Christian audience, and would never really heard of Hinduism before. And he gives a positive version of Hinduism that people really were receptive to. And these words are really important. I know the last time I was in Chicago, I went to an art museum, and they had words from this speech that were actually displayed in like bright lights on this staircase. And even people in Chicago to this day will talk about the World Parliament of Religions and Swami Vivekananda. So what does Swami Vivekananda, or just Swami V as I like to call him, what does he have to say about Murti Puja, the worship of images? What does he have to say about monotheism? And what does he have to say about the Upanishads? We saw that we framed a lot of the arguments today about what do you think about idols? What do you think about the Upanishads? And what do you think about monotheism? So for Thursday, you have a response paper due. You're going to email that to me. You follow the email to Gmail. And then you're going to read Swami Vivekananda's speeches at the World Parliament of Religion in 1893, not 1983. You can see my dyslexia on display right there. I'm happy to be with y'all. I'm looking forward to having a good class with you, finishing out this year strong. I want to see all of you succeed. Keep your correspondence with me professional, but always open. If you get behind, if you get lost, if you get confused, if you have any concerns, write to me right away. The biggest problem with online learning is people get a little bit behind and then they get discouraged and then they get really behind and they can't get caught up. I want everyone to succeed. If you're struggling, contact me. We will make a plan for your success. I am here for you. And yes, I do always talk this fast. That's how it goes. All right, take care, and I'm going to see you on Thursday. Have a good one, and enjoy reading Swami V. He's one of my favorites. All right, talk to you soon. Bye-bye now.